This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and their guests only. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. And because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Welcome to Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces. Linda Mazur, Jack Mazur, and Ellen Bennett are three fierce advocates, two moms and a dad who are passionate about changing the way eating disorders and mental illness are viewed in our society. Linda, Jack, and Ellen believe we need to stop the stigma, band together, and help people find resources and support early on. They advocate to foster awareness, enhance education, and improve treatment, as well as to help society understand and embrace individuals and families who are affected by eating disorders and all mental health conditions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are two moms and a dad starting the conversation to raise awareness, educate, and stop the stigma surrounding suicide, depression, eating disorders, and all mental health issues, because everyone's mental health matters. I'm Linda Mazur, and my co-hosts are my husband, Jack, and our dear friend, Ellen Bennett. And in a moment, you will meet a very special guest of ours. But first, I'd like to start by reading a quote. And this quote is by Leonard Cohen. "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." Leonard Cohen is best known for his beautiful song, Hallelujah, which some argue is the greatest song ever written. Hallelujah took him 5 years to write, and after he did, his label didn't want to release the album it was on. Later in his career, Leonard Cohen began talking about the stigma surrounding mental health and his personal struggle with depression, which actually began when he was a teenager. Did you guys know that? Did either of you know that?
No. No, I didn't. Obviously, we were touched just recently by someone who took their own life at 39 years old. And we just went through that last week with calling hours. And
Very dear friend.
Dear friend of ours, dear friend of Emily's. Mm-hmm. And it just seems this whole past year and a half it's been that COVID has just exacerbated the amount of people that are taking their own lives. And again, it goes back to the lack of connections. Connections is so important in people's lives and in all our lives. And especially if you have anxiety, depression, something going on, people used to get it when they went to work, and now they're working from home for a year and a half. So
you mean have the
connection?
connections?
Yeah. You get it from, so it's terrible, and it's become like an epidemic.
It's why we're here. We're starting the conversation. We're raising awareness. It has to become part of our everyday conversation. Mental health is real. It impacts all of us, young people, older people, middle age, everyone and anyone. I worked in school for years and years and witnessed on a daily basis the depression and experienced suicide in a high school and just traumatic experiences. And we need to talk about it and realize that there's issues that we need to be open about, and people need to share their pain.
Absolutely. And sometimes people are very adept at not letting others know how they feel because of the stigma or because they want to protect someone else the shame surrounding it. And instead of reaching out, they just go further inward, and that's the worst thing. So
So if you notice changes in people and friends, family, coworkers, whatever, just reach out to them. Just ask them if everything's okay, and if they need to talk, they need to go for a cup of coffee, whatever. And this statistic blew me away that there's more than 47,500 suicides each year in the United States, which makes it the 10th leading cause of death amongst adults, and the second leading cause of death among individuals 10 to 34 years of age. 10 to 34 years of age.
Frightening statistics. Women are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than men, but men are 4 times more likely to have successful attempts. There are 2.5 times more suicides than homicides in 2019. We have a crisis here. We need to have this conversation. There are things we need to talk about.
Well, today we have a very, very special guest. We'd like to welcome Missy Stolfi. Missy is the Area Director for the Western and Greater Central New York chapters of the American Foundation for the Prevention of Suicide. She joined the foundation in 2017 from the American Cancer Society, and prior to that served in the field of college student affairs in the Philadelphia area. Missy holds a BS in history from SUNY College at Oneonta and an M.Ed. in Higher Education Administration, Student Affairs from the University of Buffalo. She resides in Tonawanda, enjoys volunteering locally, rooting for the Yankees and the Bills, and spending time with her niece and nephew. Welcome, Missy.
Welcome, Missy. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
We are honored. Welcome.
Appreciate it.
Missy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what drew you to your current position as Area Director for Western and Central New York for the American Society for the Prevention of Suicide?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity to join you in this conversation today. I've been with the organization for over 3 years now. And I've always been in pretty mission-driven work as an adult. So going from the education field into nonprofit work. And it was when I was with my previous organization, this opportunity kind of put itself in my path. I hadn't sought it out, to be honest. But mental health is definitely something that's been a really big part of my life personally, my family, friends as well. It was definitely as a teenager, and especially when I was a college student myself, that I really also started particularly struggling with depression and anxiety, as a lot of young adults we know do. And that can be a time when a lot of, younger people start to manifest or show signs, symptoms of mental illnesses is when they're younger. And so, I'm lucky because I, had a support system. I was able to get support not just from friends, family, but also too from my college counseling center. And that really reinforced for me, the decision to go into kind of the career path that I did, which is to help and support and create opportunities for others. So whether that's been through working in higher education, which I did for about 7 years, but then also too, I hit my own kind of, quarter life, third life crisis at the age of 30, which resulted in a career change and making a move back home to Western New York and trying to figure out what I wanted to do next with my life. And I'd experienced burnout even though I was young. And so, but I'd been working professionally since I was 21 and working just a really, it was a tough field and not making a lot of money and, starting to feel some of the strain of, changes in my personal life and feeling far away from my family. And I'm really grateful that, I had the support to make that kind of pivot back home and to recognize that I can take those skills, experiences that I had and put them to work through still having mission-driven work through nonprofit, working with volunteers, working in events, education, programming, all that kind of stuff. AFSP really, once that kind of came up as an opportunity, the more I learned about the organization and its mission and the opportunity to do a lot of different things in the community from a very grassroots perspective, I was sold. And it's been an incredible journey. It's tough work. It certainly is. It's not lost on me that many of the people that I come across and connect with on a daily basis, including yourselves, the reason that we all come together is usually because of something so, incredibly difficult. But with that, we also have opportunity, right, to come together, share our experiences, share our knowledge, support each other in that healing, and to hopefully inspire others, to be able to make changes, not only individually, but as a culture as well around the topic of mental health and suicide prevention specifically.
So where there's pain, you rush in when other people turn away.
Yeah.
Great example.
It's wonderful, wonderful work you're doing.
Thank you.
Does the American Foundation for the Prevention of Suicide, does it have chapters all throughout the country?
Absolutely. We are in all 50 states. So anywhere you live in the U.S., you have a chapter you can tap into to get involved, get resources. So we here today are speaking to you from the Western New York chapter. I work specifically with the Western New York chapter as well as our Greater Central. So a large chunk of the upstate New York territory is kind of under myself and my associate area director. And we have staff and volunteers across the country who are out there doing this work in all 50 states, in big cities, in tiny towns, and everywhere in between. We are an organization that's been around since 1987. We started as a research organization back when very few people were really studying and trying to, understand the science behind this complex health issue of suicide. And it's really, the organization has really grown very quickly in recent years too, because people are starting to see the need for supporting, for better understanding, better education and advocacy. And because we are moving through a lot of the stigmas that have prevented people from opening up and having these kind of conversations too. We have a lot of ways to go yet, but we've also come up our way too, where a podcast like this even exists. Goes to show what's come in just even recent years.
So do you cover like from Route 80, one which pretty much cuts the state in half, everything west of there? Or
yeah, I go all the way out to like Oneonta, Cobleskill, up to Watertown,
Much,
Binghamton.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So then there's another chapter down in Albany or something?
Oh, yeah. There's a capital region. There's a Hudson Valley, all about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is incredible to learn about this important resource in our region and across the country. What resources are available in the regions that you cover? Do you have programs for adults, colleges, schools?
Yeah, great question. And so everything that we do with AFSP falls into a few main categories. One, of course, is our research program that we fund. A big piece is prevention education. So that includes a number of community and school-based programs that we're able to provide, most of them free of charge to the community, as ways to really bring that baseline information to the community, talk about the statistics, talk about the language of suicide, risk factors, warning signs, what are things we can do as protective factors, how to have conversations with people about mental health, whether it is, in the workplace, whether it is in faith communities, schools, whether it is colleges, anywhere you can think of. We've presented our programs in all sorts of different settings, large and small, all sorts of odd places at times too. And, but really start to create more of that visibility really for the topic, because if we avoid it, it's not going to go away. We know that. We know avoiding it does not make it go away. The statistics you cited earlier are incredibly real. And to create that visibility and to open up and let people know that there are resources wherever you may be in the country, right? We also engage in advocacy efforts at the state and federal level to impact public policy. We're a nonpartisan organization, but recognizing that you have lawmakers, people with the power of the purse, who can help us with creating access to resources, remove barriers to care, help with workforce development, right? To make sure we're attracting and keeping people in the mental health care fields, right? And so a lot of opportunities there for people to use their voices and to be advocates. And then we also provide loss and healing resources and programs to provide support for people who have been impacted either through suicide loss or perhaps their own lived experience with suicidal attempts or ideations to really help break that cycle, right? Because we know having had proximity, close proximity to a suicide, whether it's your own attempt or the death of a loved one or someone you care about, can be a risk factor for your own. And so that is we call it post-vention, is really a part of prevention. So everything we do really kind of falls into one of those main areas. And we also engage with our community through fundraising and community events such as our Out of the Darkness walks, which is not just a fundraiser, but also a way that people can connect with people who know what they've been through, right? And so that can be an incredibly powerful experience as well, to be with folks who understand, who get it, who aren't going to judge you, right? And who are there to give you a hug or, a squeeze of the hand and who know your story and who'll hear your story.
Right. Out of the Darkness walk. That all of a sudden I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
I have
now
a connection.
Heard that.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Okay.
Well, good. We'll have to get you in for this year's.
Yes.
Great cause.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in just the last few months, 2 people who were close to us have passed. One was a male and a friend and former neighbor of ours, and one was a young, beautiful young woman, a young female, and was a very close friend of the family. Her whole family. I mean, we're a close family, so there's no one that suicide doesn't touch in some way, and I think it's so hard for the people that are left because it's such a unique kind of grief.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There was a man that I met. I was just going to the mailbox one day, and I saw this man walking down the sidewalk, back and forth every day. He walked every day. And I knew he lived maybe half a mile up the road. And he had seen Linda and I on the news, and he stopped and told me that, back in, I think, April of, 2020? So April 2020, right around when everything shut down.
Yeah.
His son had committed suicide, and, we just hugged each other, and, I became a safe person for him to talk to,
Right.
and that's what we need. We need people that are out there and have lived experience and understand what people are going through and how hard it is. People always say, move on. You never move on. You move forward, and we move forward trying to make things changes and make things better.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that story. And I think you're absolutely right, is having support of each other goes such a long way. Suicide loss is a very specific type of grief. And to have someone who understands that and knows that and doesn't have to feel awkward or tiptoeing around a subject, right, can go such a long way, of reassurance. And so that's, some of what we aim to do through our loss and healing, programs is to be able to help make those connections as well.
So we're just coming through COVID here. Hopefully things are just going to get better and better. But what are your thoughts and observations about the vast region you cover regarding depression and suicide? And I guess I would ask how COVID has impacted your program. And I wonder how our geographic area compares to the rest of the country.
Yeah, a lot of great questions there. When we do, I don't have them all right in front of me, but we do have actually a lot of statistics we do share. We, closely monitor with the CDC in terms of suicide rates, not only death rates, but, hospitalizations, attempts as well. When it comes across the country, because certainly the statistic you cited earlier about suicide being the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., that is across the board, all backgrounds, demographics, groups, right? So when you start breaking out different demographics, racial groups, gender, sexual orientation, geography, right? Those numbers will start to move around. New York State, when we look state by state in the U.S., New York State is usually at either 49 or 50 at the bottom as far as rates per 100,000 people. However, New York State has a lot of people in it, right? Okay. So even though we have fewer as far as our overall percentage, that's still a lot of people, right? However, we're very proud of that rate. We know that's not good enough, but that does go to show that there is a lot of effort, in the state of New York as far as mitigation and prevention efforts. But we know we can always do better. When we look across the country, different states, the rankings as far as those rates per 100,000 vary. And also even within New York, county by county, right? It'll change. And so there's statistics that are tracked for each county in the U.S. And I'll tell you, the last year and a half especially, a lot of the localities have very closely been monitoring these particular numbers. So I know it feels like when it comes to anything about public health, it's all been about COVID lately. But New York State and the counties have really been tracking very closely, what are the impacts very locally, right? It can be a tricky thing. Data collection for suicide deaths can be really tricky, and for attempts. Not all attempts require hospitalization, so they may not get reported. And suicide deaths, it's not always 100% clear if it was an intended death. And so data collection is getting better in this country. Our national violent death reporting system is becoming more universal. So with that, we need that information, right? Because all of that, the data, the science, that drives all of the prevention efforts. And so we do know that, in addition to what we would normally see throughout the year, there's different times of years. We might see kind of peaks and valleys as far as attempts and death rates. Suicide deaths are most common in the springtime, around May and June, actually. And but when it comes to COVID, it's important to remember suicide is complex. The causes of it are complex. And COVID and all that came along with COVID certainly has exacerbated for many people who maybe were already at risk, maybe were already struggling with mental health, certainly financial considerations, having to have losses of all sorts, including losing loved ones to COVID, or perhaps having serious long-term, health effects. The lack of, the isolation, lack of connection definitely was a huge concern. For some people, they actually had more eyes and attention on them, having their kids at home, right? But for some kids, they were like, okay, it's been easier being at home and not at school. Other kids, it was the other way around. We saw a lot of statistics, unfortunately, a lot of LGBTQ youth. There was a lot of concern because they were at home 24/7 with unsupportive families. Then that was incredibly difficult. Perhaps school was their safe place, right? Maybe it was harder for teachers to be able to keep an eye on kids, right? Who might be having troubles at home. So, but in other cases, kids are around more. Their parents were working from home. They actually could keep a closer eye on their kids than maybe they normally would. It's really important, too, to make sure when we're talking about COVID and mental health, we're still figuring out what that looks like. And there's still probably going to be some long-term ramifications, certainly. More people had expressed, increased feelings of depression and anxiety and suicidal ideation and called more for help. But that doesn't necessarily equate to deaths, okay? That's a good thing they're calling for help. Or that people were going out of their way to check in on each other because we were isolated. So there were actually some bright spots. People who engaged and moved to telehealth options were keeping up with their appointments more regularly than showing up in person previously. Or they were having the option in the first place because telehealth maybe wasn't even an option. Right. And we know, unfortunately, there's still a lot of barriers for people to get mental health care regularly, such as transportation, such as cost, right? So I would say, for lack of a better word, it's been a mixed bag. And it's really important to consider is we're still learning. We still don't have the full picture, the data, the numbers, whether it's New York State or nationally. Some early indications show, actually 2019 was the first time we saw a decrease in national death rates for suicide in this country in a decade, which was definitely a sign of hope. Our statistics, our complete statistics, are always about 2 years behind. It takes a long time to get all that data, crunch those numbers, and to analyze it, right? So 2019, we had those statistics from the CDC nationwide. Some early data indicated nationwide there had been some additional decreases, but that's not, that's taking everything into consideration. So some states saw a lot higher, some lower, et cetera. But it's too early for us to completely say what the full picture is. And to remember, it's going to take time for everyone to adjust, coming back into, quote, real life, right? It's, definitely the way we do business and school and relationships and healthcare. So many things have changed. Some things may never fully go back, right? So we have to remember and continue to keep that vigilance, keep connecting, checking in with people, taking care of ourselves too. So it's really important to make sure how we talk about it matters, that we don't want it to be a foregone conclusion. We don't want to make people feel like, okay, well, what's the use of me hanging on hope, right? And so that's really important too, is that we can look at it and take it very seriously. The mental health issues and concerns that are very, very real and very wide, but it doesn't mean it needs to be a foregone conclusion either that rates will necessarily have to go up. And so, like I said, data-wise, still an incomplete picture. So that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind when it comes to looking at 2020 on the whole, and certainly even we're still way too early in 2021 to know for sure. But that's why, again, it's really important. I think if anything, we have an opportunity. I believe that the pandemic really shone a brighter spotlight on the topic of mental health for people who maybe never even gave it a second thought, right? Because it hadn't impacted them. And lucky for them, it hadn't impacted them. But it definitely brought it much more to the forefront. I think some people, especially those in this room, we've been beating that drum for some time, right?
Right.
And unfortunately, sometimes it takes something dramatic for attention to come to a cause. And we're starting to see that a lot more people are starting to open up. They're sharing their stories, including some very powerful, famous, notable people who have a powerful platform is really incredible. A lot of young people, they are talking more about it. And they're struggling, but they're talking. They don't want to keep silent on it. And so they're really leading the way in some very creative ways to share stories and to connect with each other. So I also see some of the opportunity that comes out of this pandemic. It's important we sustain it though, right? That we don't forget how it was. And we don't just get used to like, okay, we're back to normal now. We have to remember what that was like and how important it was that someone was checking in and calling to see how are you doing, right? We need to keep that up for each other as well.
Yeah, we have very short memories.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
But, the media, the news media I've seen more coverage of mental health over the last year than ever before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's really powerful.
You said a lot of famous people, and they have a voice and they get attention. But just like, in our cause of eating disorders, when somebody famous passes away from an eating disorder, there's, everybody feels terrible and they get all the attention. But my point is that everybody is important, whether you're famous, because everybody's famous in someone's eyes. And
right.
every
That's
family,
a good way to put it.
Emily was famous for us. Katie was famous.
She was the superstar of your family.
Right. So, we just need to put a face on all these people.
Absolutely.
That every 52 minutes from an eating disorder is passing away, and the suicide rate is even higher than that. So
it all comes back to just the shame and the stigma, and that's really hard on the families, left behind too. But it's not a choice. It's not a choice. People are in so much pain that it just overtakes them, and they're not thinking as rationally as they would if their brain wasn't so affected by depression, anxiety, and eating disorder.
Yeah.
You can go on and on. So,
Hopefully.
this friend of ours that, took her life a couple of weeks ago, it's, we went and brought dinner to her house and her dog was there. Her dog, Murray, was there. And I just looked in it and he was going around looking in all the rooms and stuff. And I just wonder how you get to that point, how life becomes that hard, and
well, it does. And we're very human, and we all have times that life is devastating and we're cracked and broken. I mean, it's just part of existence some of the time. And you can't blame, people. Your heart just goes out to the victims and their families, and it's just what it is.
And we need to share the experiences and make that common and understandable so that we all become a lot more compassionate and have a level of understanding so that we can all help to end that stigma and shame. That so these conversations and that awareness and encouraging people to say something, connect, communicate is so important. And I like how you mentioned that, there are some cracks of light in the COVID and our current experiences that really are going to allow some of this to shine through and change and impact all of us in a really good way.
Absolutely. And it's about getting educated. A lot of it is about getting educated. And the more that we can have conversations about mental health and building resiliency and those coping skills from earlier ages, and those are all going to be different depending where your developmental stage is, right? But, the fact that we're starting to see that is programs like that in elementary schools, and how to talk about and process your feelings in a healthy way, right?
Right.
And how to create healthy habits, physical and mental, because all of that is really related too. We were in a culture of just go, go, go and busy and achieve and work hard and then work even harder, right? And COVID definitely kind of slammed the brakes on that for a lot of us. And, it teaches that we need to maybe change some of our ways, and we need to stop and educate ourselves. How can we do better by ourselves and each other, right? And treat ourselves better, and with some more compassion is that word as well. And educating ourselves on those risk factors and warning signs, so that if we're starting to learn these things or notice these things, these changes in each other, it can prompt that conversation. So like you said, Jack, about, asking someone, are you doing okay? Or let's go grab a cup of coffee and catch up, right? That you can kind of have that in the back of your mind, is if I'm noticing some of these things that seem pretty atypical for my friend or my colleague, I can start to look at it through the lens. Could this be tied to their mental health, right? Could this be a sign that their mental health is kind of, starting to deteriorate? Maybe they're starting to lose their grip on hope, and start to have these conversations earlier in the process for somebody, so that they know that they're cared about and that they're supported.
And you go back to lived experience too, for somebody who is having a really hard time, but their friend Joe down the street went through a really hard time too, and he had shared that and talked about it, and he made it through. And there's hope. I mean, there's hope. There's a crack of light. There's some hope there. So that lived experience with everything is one of the most valuable resources.
Absolutely.
Were you going to say something, Ellen? I didn't mean
I was going to say, what are some of the signs that maybe we should be tuned into or aware of, in case maybe we should be more concerned?
Yeah, for sure. Many people who are experiencing thoughts of suicide, and keep in mind, having a thought of suicide doesn't mean you're in imminent danger, right? It can be kind of like a spectrum of feelings and of intensity. But even someone who is starting to feel, more and more desperate, right? They're starting to feel more overwhelmed, experiencing more pain. They usually will display some observable signs. They could be really subtle, and definitely someone who's struggling is going to try to hide them from people that they care about, because they don't want to worry them.
Secrecy is pervasive.
For sure. And so that's where, it's really important that we're keeping those eyes out for those changes, but also that we're checking in regularly anyway, right? Sometimes we don't even know that, we're walking around fine, thinking we're fine, and we get some blood work routine at the doctor and find out, oh, there's something brewing in there we have to address, right?
Good
so
analogy.
If you don't go to the doctor regularly, you're not going to notice that, or you're not going to know it until it presents an even bigger problem that'll take even more work to diagnose or treat. Mental health is no different. So if we're not having those regular kind of check-ins with ourselves and each other and with our doctors about our mental health and well-being, that's the opportunity to intervene earlier, right? Mental health is something we live with all the time, every day. It's not always going to be 100% for any of us, right? None of us are ever going to feel 100%. But when you start to notice some changes in someone who are lingering, they're getting worse and not better. Perhaps their ways that they usually cope with their stress aren't serving them in the same way, that they just seem different. They don't seem like themselves. It's getting in the way of their day-to-day functioning, whether it's at work, home, or school. That's when it's time to have a conversation. They may say things either directly or indirectly, including joking about dying, killing themselves, or indicating that, saying things like people would be better off without me, or I wish I would just go to bed and not wake up. They may start talking about actually making plans, such as, doing research for methods, or, giving away possessions, making kind of goodbyes and arrangements. And you'll notice some changes in behaviors in terms of, they may start utilizing alcohol or other drugs more often. They may express issues with sleep or appetite. So too much or too little, it's just all over the place. It's, their engagement with others may be more withdrawn, starting, losing interest in things they normally care about. They may act really recklessly, do things that are really impulsive or dangerous, even things like reckless spending, right? And they may, have changes in appearance as well, stop taking as much pride in, how they kind of take care of themselves. And their mood also is likely it'll shift. So perhaps they're more irritable, short-tempered. It can come out in bursts of anger and rage too, especially in men and boys. Depression can show itself as more anger, and sometimes with little ones, with kids, it looks as behavior problems and they get labeled as a bad kid. But actually, a lot of times it stems from something that's mental health related. And so, or, they may be easily humiliated. They can't bounce back as easily from setbacks. And so really it's about paying attention to where are those changes that seem to be lingering and sticking around, and that aren't getting better. And that are just getting in the way, and those, when you start to notice those changes, those are an opportunity to start a conversation, because it's like, hey, I've noticed X, Y, and Z. Do you want to talk about it? That can be an opening, right? Even if you talk to them and it turns out, suicide is not the thing at play here, likely they're having still a hard time. Because if you've noticed some of these changes, likely something's going on that's bothering them and is distressing. So it's still an opportunity to have that kind of conversation early.
So you mentioned kids. What's the youngest age that you've dealt with of somebody committing suicide or attempting it?
It really depends. AFSP, we're not a direct service organization in the sense we don't, we're not counselors, things like that. But we know that there are, very young kids in elementary school who are, starting to express thoughts of suicide. And that's the thing, is that it can also go up to very old age as well across the lifespan. It's still very rare for a young person, especially in elementary school. It's still a very rare thing. But because it's so big and serious and scary, it feels huge, right? So statistically, it is still very rare. However, the fact that we have younger and younger students expressing this level of distress certainly shows that there is need for more intervention and education at that level too, including how to process and manage their feelings and emotions, and making sure is that there are, professionals, whether it's a teacher, school counselors, it's pediatricians, et cetera, who are having these conversations regularly to check in with the kids as well as the family members. Really, it's really important, because physical health and mental health are just the same. They're just as important. And so we have kind of regular things that we say and do.
Amen.
Right? They're just as important, and they're very much linked with each other. And so sometimes a kid is talking about having a stomach ache and wants to stay home from school. That could actually be anxiety and not necessarily like a stomach flu, right? So it's about making sure we're asking those right questions too, because kids are still figuring out the language for all this, right? And so so these are things that, we can all start to do a little better by our kids, but also with that is to role model. How do we deal with stuff? Little ones pick up on what the older ones are doing and saying and feeling. If we're all stressed, if we're freaking out about stuff, they're looking to us for that. They pick up on that. They sense it. And so we want to make sure is that, we're role modeling, taking care of ourselves, talking openly about our feelings, validating our feelings too is super important as well, because it may not feel like a big deal to us, but it's a big deal to them. Therefore, it's a big deal, right? Yeah.
I should mention that the programs that the American Foundation for the Prevention of Suicide, the resources are going to be available in the show notes. So at the end, you can just go back and look at the show notes and all the wonderful information that Missy has provided to us is available for all of you. Missy, are there any genetic links to people that make them more predisposed to developing depression and suicidal ideation?
There can be. As I mentioned before, when it comes to suicide risk, there's not a single cause of suicide risk, but there are combinations of risk factors that can come together in a way that really start to exceed a person's ability to cope with them. And so risk factors really fall into kind of three main categories of health-related, which includes mental health conditions, and historical factors, so things that are your family history, your personal history, and then as well as environmental factors. And those are the conditions of your life or the world around you and how those impact you as well. So it's really kind of a coming together of aspects of all three of those that can really elevate someone's risk. And that's going to look different for each individual, of course. So when it comes to those historical factors, much like having risk of a heart attack because of high blood pressure and your family history of heart disease, right? there can be a higher risk because if you have family history of suicide, family history of mental health conditions like depression or substance use disorders, yes, there can be a link there. It doesn't mean you automatically are going to die by suicide. Just like having family history of heart disease doesn't mean you're going to have a heart attack, right? But it's really important that we're getting more in that direction of understanding family history. We don't always have that complete information even about stuff like heart disease and diabetes, right? And we've been getting those questions asked for years at the doctor. We're starting to get those questions asked of us at the doctor as well around mental health. But unfortunately, we don't always have complete pictures from family history because for generations, we didn't talk about that, right?
Talk about it.
Or we just didn't have words for it. A lot of the things that, our grandparents dealt with have completely different names for them, right? Mm-hmm. So grandpa came home from World War II with shell shock. We know that now to be PTSD, right? We have some better understandings, of a lot of different conditions. And so things that, we learn more now, we're like, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense, right? Looking back. And so that's another reason why having these stories, having these conversations is important, because if we as adults are able to more own our stories around our mental health, that helps our kids and their kids to better know the family history. Not only to know the history, but how do we deal with that better, right? How do we tackle that in a more proactive way? Only because we know better now, right? Everybody did the best they could with the information they had in previous generations, right? They did the best they could with what they had. But now we know better. We have an opportunity to shift and change that culture so that the next generation can have more of those tools as well.
Yeah. I mean, so well said. It's just, we just got to move forward and make it better.
Mm-hmm.
Well, open up and share and
Absolutely.
utilize the resources that are available.
Yeah.
For sure.
We benefited from others coming before us when it comes to all things health related, right? Mm-hmm. And so now we have a chance to make those changes when it comes to mental health.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. One of my realizations after my daughter's struggle with anorexia was that I should have kept the conversation going. We should have continued to talk about the struggle and the reality. She being first diagnosed at age 11, and then later on she was in recovery, and it was kind of like you were like, oh, okay, things are good. Things are good. They need to stay good.
Yeah.
But now I realize reflection is a beautiful thing. That probably we should have kept the conversation. How are you doing?
Yeah.
Have a plan in place, ongoing. But that transcends any mental health or disruption in your life, that you need to keep that going. Have those check-ins. What are you doing? How are you feeling? How's that impacting you? Mm-hmm. Another example, my other daughter struggles with anxiety and sees a counselor and takes medication, but there'll be moments in our lives when I can see her anxiety flaring a little bit. Mm-hmm. But it's common conversation for me to be comfortable saying, hey, how are you handling your anxiety? Are you okay with this? Do you need, and those are the type of, we need to be aware, we need to understand, we need to educate, but have those conversations because it's just like talking about, how's your diabetes? How's your heart problem?
Oh, yeah.
How's that leg problem?
Right.
It's that the brain, the mental health, and the body are one. And so those conversations need to be as natural.
Right. Yes. And that's the thing. We're still working on that part, right? Is the asking it in the first place and asking in a way where we feel more comfortable, right? Because people can kind of pick up on it if we feel super uncomfortable and scared about it. Right. We're not really setting the table for them to be open with us. And so it's not just about asking, but it's how we ask, right? And so
Good point.
you're not thinking about suicide, are you? Because that just tells me I don't want to hear the answer, right?
Right.
And so, it is really important, is like you said, is that it's a maintenance kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. For a lot of people, these conditions are chronic, or, they'll kind of come and go in different episodes throughout the lifespan, and that's okay. But if you know kind of what to look for, and you know kind of what someone's personal kind of triggers or activators are, then those are things you can kind of check on. You have some baseline, you have some benchmarks to tap into. And so and that's where too, is we tell people a lot of times is reach out if you need help. But if you're really, really struggling with something like an eating disorder, like depression, it can be so overwhelming that the thought of asking for help might feel near impossible in that moment. So we have an opportunity, the rest of us to check in too, right? And say, okay, well, how are you doing? And so, and yes, we would love if everybody would always just come to us when anything's bothering them, right? I'm sure even as like a husband and wife, you're like, I really wish that they would have told me they were upset about all the dirty clothes on the floor instead of just getting, mad at me, right? And so, you know what I mean? So we would love if everybody would always let us know what's on their mind, but they don't always, right? So we have a chance to pick up on like, hey, is everything okay? Something seems like it's bothering you, and have that conversation before it kind of blows up. And so, so I think, that's where, again, we have an opportunity to kind of make that shift in the conversation.
Think Mr. Rogers. What would Mr. Rogers say?
Exactly.
So the one thing we've found out is eating disorders, have the highest mortality rate of anything other than opioid abuse, addiction. And as many as 50% of people that suffer from an eating disorder will attempt suicide. And can you explain why that is?
Sure. And so, when we talk about mental health conditions, that's a really broad phrase, which refers to a whole, umbrella of different conditions. And even when you say something like depression, a lot of different forms of depression and kind of levels of intensity as far as the role it plays in someone's life. And when it comes to suicide risk is there can be co-occurrence of mental health conditions. And when it comes to eating disorders, people with eating disorders tend to have multiple mental health conditions going on at the same time, which you can imagine starts to elevate the risk. They start to exacerbate each other. So people living with an eating disorder tend to also be experiencing depression or anxiety or a substance use disorder, right? Or other self-harming behaviors. And so, so because of that, that can really elevate and intensify that risk. And so, but that can happen, even if the eating disorder isn't in the mix. If someone is dealing with both depression and a substance use disorder, you can see how they would start to really play off each other. And it just makes things that much more intense. And also, too, it means treatment maybe, is more involved and may take some more time. And so that's the thing is with eating disorders in particular, it tends to co-occur with another mental health condition. So it means there's a lot to kind of unpack there when it comes to treatment. Yeah. And even diagnosis in the first place can be, perhaps a little more complicated.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When you were talking earlier about the statistics for, suicides and how hard it is to tabulate,
Oh, yeah.
You got 47,500. Well, it may be much more than that, And it's the same with eating disorders because, people die from a heart attack or a suicide or whatever, and it's not related to an eating disorder.
Right.
So, Oh, we just have to do so much better, and we just have to educate the medical community and the insurance community.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's a lot of the work that we do too through our advocacy efforts as well as really in terms of healthcare, in terms of parity, all that kind of stuff too. You're right. Yeah. There's been work done. There's still ways to go there too, in terms of how we just better understand, all of these as health issues, right? To make sure it's that, and you're starting to see some of those changes where, mental health can be used as a reason why, you need to maybe take a day off from school, and it would be an excused absence and things. I remember days where I was just feeling overwhelmed, but you'd have to fake a physical illness in order to get your mom to stay home and have a note to write, And so why? We shouldn't have to do that, right? And so, so absolutely, that's some of those efforts certainly that are underway and need to continue.
This is such a powerful conversation. I'm really enjoying it and having all these kind of aha moments and making so many connections. And the stigma and shame surrounding suicide is like the stigma and shame around so many other things. But the stigma with suicide and the family, when a loved one has committed suicide, somehow it seems more intense, as if the family needs to kind of almost hide because there's a level of shame. And that's really tragic because you need to be embraced and you need to feel a community. You need to feel supportive, no matter what the cause of death is, that there's that grief and it's tragic. And no one should be judged. Right. We all walk our path and we all choose different roads, and we need to compassion, and understanding. And look, if that was for the grace of God, I didn't walk in those shoes, kind of thing.
But could have.
Exactly.
Yeah. But for the grace of God, go
right.
on.
But
Right.
for the grace of
Right.
God. And I think we feel that all the time, all the time. So make a long question shorter. How can we better support individuals who are in this situation that may feel isolated and ostracized? I know, Jack, Linda, and I have talked about even within our experience and our daughters, we've felt that people kind of just, oh, well, that happened to them. It's not going to happen to me. And kind of, Linda, you or Jack, you may have a better way of phrasing it, but
I think that
it's isolating.
they have compassion, but they don't understand what it is to succumb to a mental illness. Okay.
Yeah.
So nobody chooses. I don't know. Maybe this isn't the right way to word this, but I don't think somebody wakes up and says, oh, I'm going to commit suicide today, or I'm going to have eating disorder. They have illnesses that change the way their brain is working.
Yes.
And we can't hold them responsible for that. Somebody can have those things and choose not to do that. But if something is so painful that is the result, I just think they couldn't. I have to just believe they were in so much pain they couldn't help themselves. And I think sometimes the reaction that you get from people, because people will say, Emily died in hospice care because of anorexia, but people almost think that was like a slow suicide.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a choice. People don't understand it. And some people have been absolutely wonderful. Family has been wonderful. But it makes people uncomfortable because they don't understand it. And it's not, sometimes it just feels like it's not as tragic as when other young people die or when other people die. And it's just as tragic. And I think it's, if anything is even harder on the family, and I don't know how you compare any of this, you can't because everything is horrible, but it's a different kind of guilt and grief because, what coulda, shoulda, what could I done? What should I done? Should I, what could I have done differently? A week ago, 3 years ago, you go back and you look at everything. And I think that's the place where faith kind of comes in. And I think you have to just do the best you can. And you're going to have those days where you let things, roll back, but you have to find a way to look at it and just understand and love the person that's not here anymore and know that they did their best. And we have to just keep doing our best because that's what they would want for us too. So I don't know. I'm not great at putting that into words right now, but I think that's my next book. I'm working on it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just from this past couple weeks, this mom that's now, lost a daughter, and it's wonderful. Her other two daughters are going to stay with her for a month or two. And there was an outpouring at the calling hours and at the memorial the next day and everything. But I said to Linda, we just have to continue to contact her. And
Of course we will. Of course we will.
But I mean, a lot of times, there's that original outpouring,
right.
and it can be from,
for any cause of death,
for
we
any
see
cause
that,
of death, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's just, we all go about our daily lives, and it's...
Yeah. And I think that's important too, is, that's an important reminder for anyone we know who's experiencing, grief, is that it is a journey, it's a process, it's not linear. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to suicide loss, people get even more uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. A lot of times it's, I don't know what to say, so they tend to not say anything, which ends up feeling worse because it turns into an avoidance. Right. And you're right. And I think, Linda, like you said, a lot of it is they don't fully understand. We tend to be able to wrap our heads more around a death from cancer, right? Or or heart disease, or if they had an accident, right? We can wrap our heads around that. It feels more tangible, more concrete. Mental health issues tend to be more invisible to us, or we don't understand them as much. They're still maybe more complicated as well. And with that can be a lot of blame and shame and guilt that we tend to not put on ourselves or each other when it's other causes of death. And so that's something that's really important to remember, is that it wasn't, and I think you mentioned this earlier too, is that someone who's in a suicidal crisis is not thinking rationally or clearly. So if we're trying to make sense of it with our own rational minds, it's not going to compute, right? It's not going to compute, especially if they've never been around someone who struggles, right? Then it can be also difficult for them, because sometimes people, they mean well. They're like, oh, well, just get over it. It'll be fine. Or everybody has a hard time. They say things that maybe are well-meaning, but are very invalidating, right? And so I think sometimes people, they don't know what to say. So they either say something that ends up being a lot less helpful, or they say nothing and then they just kind of shy away. And both of those feel pretty crummy when you are the family, right? And that's where I think a lot of times finding those connections with others who have been in that space before, especially if it's someone who maybe has had a newer loss, to connect with someone who maybe it's been some time, because it can show that hope that, you know what, life does go on. It goes on differently. You're forever changed by that, right? But it does go on. And how can it go on? And what are the ways it can? And when inevitably you're going to have those hard times that will flare up, sometimes very unexpectedly, right? That's okay. And you can move through those moments. And I think that's, again, where it's important to remember there are those resources and supports. We have our Healing Conversations program. We have support groups. We also have the International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day, which takes place every November in communities across the country and across the world. And, ways to really connect people who have been in that space and who still are there, who have been there in different forms maybe, or different relationships to that person, but that they can share in that what's worked. Sometimes just hug each other, sometimes just cry, because you need to feel your feelings. That's the other thing too, is sometimes we're uncomfortable when people express emotions. If people cry, or if people scream or get mad, or sometimes we laugh when something terrible happens, because the body's just weird sometimes, the things that happen. And we tend to be socialized that, like, okay, don't show that, right? But we need to allow that human side of us. And so, being able to find a network of people where you can express that. Also, too, for people who have experienced a suicide loss, too, look into things like their own counseling for their grief as well, and can be incredibly helpful. And that's even an area that AFSU does a lot of work in terms of training clinicians on suicide bereavement, because unfortunately, they don't have that training of how do I work with, people who have experienced this particular type of grief. And so, so the more, again, it goes back to that education and awareness, so that we can have more fruitful, I guess, conversations with somebody who's experienced suicide loss, no matter where they are in their journey. Because, no matter what, for years to come, even if you feel and you've been generally okay, stuff can kind of pop up, right? And so, we want to be able to know that we have something to tap into for support in those moments.
Great. Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Well, is there anything else that you would like to share with us, or that we should have asked you and didn't?
I mean, your questions have been incredibly thorough, and certainly appreciate, especially your own perspectives and your own stories, and so I just want to thank all of you for that, and for inviting me into this space, but also for the work that you're all doing, that is incredibly personal and truly a labor of love, I know. I think the big thing is to remember, again, we all have mental health. We need to take care of it. We need to speak up for it, and we need to look out for each other. I know some of the links that, will be shared in the show notes include a guide on how to have a conversation with someone about mental health. It doesn't have to be just up to the psychologist to have those conversations. Yes. Any of us can do it. It doesn't mean you need to try and be everyone's therapist. We're not trying to do that either, but you can be the one to initially break that ice for somebody. And we want to help people feel less nervous and scared about those conversations, feel less awkward about them, create that visibility. And like you said, that normalcy, that's the important thing, is we need to normalize mental health, because it's there, and not talking about it is not doing the trick. So we want to really encourage everybody, take some time to educate yourself, and, think about what are things that I can unlearn, right? I think we're unlearning some stuff around mental health too. So be open to learning and unlearning and asking questions. There's so many resources out there. So I hope that, especially the challenges of these last couple years, is that I hope it's sparking some interest in this topic too for some folks. You don't need to wait for a crisis to happen to be proactive and to be knowledgeable on this topic, right? And so I encourage everyone to do a little bit more reading, look at research, follow, different blogs or websites or, social media that, helps share this information. I think, we all have an opportunity to really start to be more proactive with mental health. That's going to really what's collectively will help shape and change our culture. All of us have a role we can play, and all of us should play that role too. And I thank you for playing the role that you are, through using your voices collectively in this way. And I'm just thrilled to have been a part of it today.
I always say everybody knows somebody, who's
Absolutely.
Struggling. So
Absolutely.
And today we're better because we're 2 moms, a dad, and Missy.
Thank you so much. This is an incredible conversation. Incredible.
Thank you, Missy.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It means a lot that you were here. Please share this information about our podcast, Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces, on social media and on the platform that you listen to it on. It means so much to us. Thank you.